McDonald. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia University, and I study climate change as a local issue in Miami. Climate change can be part of any beat, and that means that coverage of climate change often is confined to, say, science or environment, and there are a lot of incredibly talented and skilled professionals who are covering climate change within that beat. And my suggestion is that climate change, because it is a societal problem that spans every sector, that you don't just have to be a specialist to be covering climate change. And I think that that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, not everybody is interested in reading about science. They don't sort of connect it to their interests. And so I think it's really important for people to be reading or seeing journalists that they trust who maybe cover economics or cover real estate to connect climate change to the things that they care about. But then number two, I think that it's important because the structure of news actually helps to inform the way that we think about things. And so if climate change is only part of the science and environmental beats, then it's easy to kind of see it as a niche issue. And I think that's partly to do with the way that maybe editors have seen climate change too, but I think that it helps to reinforce this kind of separateness of the problems of climate change. So I research climate change as a local issue in Miami, and that actually started from this feeling that climate change does seem to be kind of distant from our everyday problems. So I wanted to look at it as a local issue in a place that has identified itself as being vulnerable to climate change. And looking at the kinds of conversations that are happening within a community that sees itself as vulnerable. Because you can't sort of treat a whole community as though it's sort of like monolithic, that it's just, everybody thinks the same way. And I was interested in the different kinds of arguments that are coming up. How do people connect climate change to their problems, for example? So, how, for example, do the responses to climate change in Miami link to other concerns like keeping up enough tax revenue from construction? Or the problems of affordable housing in Miami. So Miamians actually spend more on their rent, more of their paycheck on rent than in any other city in the US. And so climate change and say affordable housing are very much interlinked in the discussions in Miami. But then there are other discussions that aren't being had so much, like emissions, because it's easy to talk about dealing with sea level rise, for example, but you can't see emissions. And also in Miami, people use their cars a lot. And so it actually, it's a conversation that's not being had so much. And I think that, I'm really interested in how, what's being talked about, but also what's not being talked about. Yeah, so one of the things that I've just seen is they're really thinking about how they can be holistic about covering climate change, but at the same time, they're also looking for cues from their audience. So, for example, I'm talking to one journalist who works for the local metro paper, the Miami Herald, and she's really just looking at what resonates with readers. And so it's not just about the stories that they imagine that people are going to be interested in. It's also looking at that engagement and seeing, what are the things that people are most worried about. And I think that's been a really interesting, I think that's something that you can look at as a really great practice in community journalism everywhere. But seeing how that relates to covering climate change, for example, has been just a really interesting way of digging into some of these issues. There's another a publication called The Nootropic that does community journalism, and instead of being like a newsletter, it's actually spotlights like a certain issue for a week or so, or like a neighborhood in Miami, and goes in depth into the questions that people ask about, so they ask their readers to tell them the kinds of things that they want to know. And it means that they're spotlighting different parts of the community. They're trying to help people link up with other neighborhoods, because Miami can be quite stratified. So people maybe don't necessarily go outside of their neighborhood too much. And so it helps to kind of put a human face on different parts of Miami, and also connect some of these wider issues to things like climate change. And I think that, one of the things that you can see definitely in parts of the media in Miami, it's not everywhere, but that Miami becomes kind of part of the fabric of the news, of what they're talking about. And knowing about how Miami will be affected by climate change is just as important as knowing how changes in federal law are going to affect the sectors that these reporters are talking about. I think so. As far as, because they're definitely trying to see what resonates with audiences, there has been a sort of increase in engagement with, people, really want to know where pumps are going to be installed, for example, or, if they're going to be affected by sort of changes in flooding patterns and things like that, or, how flood insurance policy affects them. And so being able to link those things is important. I think there's another question, though, about the things that maybe people don't necessarily connect with straight away, that are still important to talk about, like emissions, for example. It's maybe not such an easy thing to talk about with readers, but the interesting thing about what I've seen the journalists doing is thinking about how can you find your way in, how can you connect to something that's going to interest people, but then introduce some of these topics that aren't necessarily at face value going to be of the same kind of interest. Well, I think it's one of the things that isn't necessarily happening in Miami straight away, but so there are journalists right now who are actually doing trainings to normalize covering climate change with other journalists. And I think that journalists teaching each other, rather than feeling like they have to have covering climate change imposed on them, for example, but also explaining why knowing about how climate change is going to affect your beat, how that can help you find new stories, how it can make you a smarter reporter, also how you can find new audiences. I think that this peer-to-peer engagement is really inspiring to me, because it's not necessarily forcing a point of view on people, but more like inviting them in. And I think that that's really cool.